Hello, and welcome to this new episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And today I want to just briefly talk about business and human rights. And this is a subject that has been widely looked into by the United Nations, and it's a subject that has been thoroughly addressed, and it's very obvious that there's a need to balance both the needs of businesses, but also to ensure that their human rights protection. Now, this is an overarching subject, and we can't cover it here in totality. However, we are going to be looking at the key concepts, the key issues, and the overriding principles. So, the United Nations set out around after 6 years of work, guiding principles um, in through which businesses and states should ensure that human rights are protected. And this was a collaboration of with governments, civil society, affected individuals and communities, lawyers, investors, and other stakeholders. And the road testing of the proposals was also uh, done, and they were developed, put into operation to protect, respect, and remedy framework, quote unquote, presented by the then special representatives in 2008. And essentially, there are three pillars. One is the state duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and the need for greater access to remedy for victims of business related abuse. And this, according to the Commissioner for Human Rights, I think was then Navaran Pillay, is that these provide both a new and clear benchmark and represent an important milestone in the evolving of understanding of human rights in societies, and they also give clarity to the baseline expectations of businesses with regard to human rights in a first important step towards developing appropriate and effective responses to such problems. Those were sort of some of paraphrasing some of the language. And the guiding principles, um, they are set out, as I said, by the United Nations, and they help to sort of provide a roadmap um, towards ensuring that human rights are protected. But behind those guidelines are the key concepts which we're going to go through in brief. And so, first among those was the actual human rights uh, impact. Um, in other words, has the actual human rights impact been put in place or assessed? In other words, that the adverse impact, has already occurred or it is occurring. And the adverse human rights impact occurs when actions remove or reduce the ability of an individual to enjoy or his or her human rights. And the business relationships refer to the relationships where business has that has with business partners, entities in its value chain, and any other state or state entity that is directly linked to its business operations, products, or services. And these could include indirect business relationships and its value chain, products and services, which are beyond the first tier and minority as well as majority shareholding positions in joint ventures. And there's another concept which is characterized as complicity. And complicity has both legal and non legal meaning. Um, and as a legal matter, most national legislation prohibits complicity in the commission of a crime, and a number also allow for the minimum for criminal liability of business enterprise in such cases. And the goes on to explain that the weight of international criminal law jurisprudence indicates that the relevant standard for aiding and abetting is knowingly, quote unquote, knowingly providing practical assistance and encouragement that has a substantial impact on the commission of the crime. And some of the examples listed regarding complicity could be situations where a business um, where a business enterprise is seen to benefit from abuses committed by others, such as when it reduces costs because of slave-like practices in its supply chain or fails to speak out in the face of abuse related to its operations, products, or services, despite there being principal reason for it to do so. Even though enterprises have not yet been found complicit by a court of law for this kind of involvement in abuses, public opinion sets the bar slightly lower and can inflict significant reputational damage, especially in this age of social media and instant communication around the world. Um, Furthermore, the human rights due diligence process should uncover the risks of non legal um, or perceived, quote unquote, complicity, as well as legal complicity, and also trigger appropriate responses. And in this case, in terms of the principles here, due diligence is, of course, self evident, but it's been defined as the measure of prudence, activity, or assiduity that is properly to be expected from and ordinarily exercised by a reasonable and a prudent person under particular circumstances. I mean, that's very straightforward. The other concept is the concept of gross human rights abuses. Again, that should be self evident. However, for purposes of completeness, the UN document goes on to say that there's no uniform definition of gross human rights violations in international law, but it lists some practices that generally be included such genocide, slavery, and slave-like practices, summary or arbitrary executions, torture, forced disappearances, arbitrary and prolonged detention, and systemic discrimination. Other kinds of human rights violations include economic and social cultural rights, which can also count as gross violations if they are systemic. For example, violation taking place on a large scale or targeted on particular population or groups. However, for the individual, although it may not be classed as systemic, for the individual, it can potentially, or a group of individuals, can obviously be, you know, a serious impact. Um, The key concepts, further key concepts listed include things like the risks um, that a business enterprise and its operation may lead to in terms of adverse impact. The other concept is one of leverage, which is an advantage that gives power to influence in terms of influence. And in the context of the guiding principles, it refers to the ability of business enterprise to effect change in the wrongful practice of another party that's causing or contributing an adverse human rights impact. Then there's concept of mitigation, which again is self-evident, but actions to reduce the extent or any residue impact that requires remediation, um, or any potential human rights impact uh, can be classified as an impact that may occur but has not yet done so. Prevention, again, is the key, is very clear, it's self evidence. Action needs to be taken so that violation doesn't occur. And remediation or remedy again refers to processes that provide remedy for an adverse human rights impact and the potential substantive outcomes that can counteract or make good the adverse impact. There are other concepts which I'll just briefly summarize, such as obviously salient human rights in um, violations. Salient human rights. And in the context of a business enterprise are those that stand out as being at most risk, which will typically occur according to the sector. It's very sector specific and obviously in to be taken into an operational context. But the important point is that the guiding principles make it clear that an enterprise should not focus exclusively on the most salient human rights issues and ignore others that might arise. Um, and then obviously the severe human rights impact is self-evident. And they also mentioned stakeholders and the value chain. I think the value chain here, in terms of this context, um, is one actions that encompass, according to UN, activities that convert input into output by adding value. And it includes entities which have a direct or indirect business relationship with either a supply products or services or receive products or services from the enterprise. So the just to summarize some of the foundational principles, the business enterprise should respect human rights and they should avoid infringing on the human rights of others and should address adverse human rights impacts which they involved. And the other aspect of the guiding principle is that the responsibility of business enterprise to respect human rights refers to internationally recognized human rights, understood at a minimum as those are expressed in the International Bill of Human Rights and the principles concerning fundamental rights set out in the International Labour Organization Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Those are sort of some of the key um, guiding principles, but I'll just quickly summarize the additional human rights frameworks that may be relevant in this context. So we have the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Rights of the Child, the protection of the rights of all migrant workers and members of their families, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Declaration of the Rights of Persons belonging to national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. And in generally, in many, in sort of most instances, these rights, the rights in these instruments are associated with individuals in the specific groups they address. Um, the However, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples addresses both the human rights of indigenous individuals and the collective rights of indigenous uh, rights peoples. I mean that's a very important point to make. Um, One of the other uh, guiding principle, which I'll summarize quickly, is that the responsibility to respect human rights requires that businesses, enterprise, avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through their own activities and address such impacts when they occur. B, they seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships, even if they have not contributed to those impacts. And so um, the key points here: the causation, contribution, no contribution, but there's a link. And so those are sort of the key responsibilities of the business to in terms of addressing any potential human rights violations or abuses, whether salient or not salient. And as we've sort of seen from the United Nations document, this covers a number of areas ranging from disability, indigenous people, practices that may not be necessarily direct, but are also linked either through input or value chain and so on, and so forth. And so that is it in a nutshell in terms of the some of the key core principles of relating to business and human rights. I mean, it's a very sort of wide subject, which we can't cover here in one go, but it's a subject, nevertheless, that is very um, that is very consequential and present, especially in today's globalized world, where products are made and services are made in a different country and consumed in a different country, and where there's the divide between the global north and global south, where some are the producers and others are the consumers, and where the links between and the quality of life and the human rights between those who produce the products and those who consume them are equally protected. Um, and so, just in the context of this, the businesses should comply with all applicable laws and respect international recognized human rights wherever they operate. They must seek ways to honor the principles of international recognized human rights when faced with conflicting requirements. And they need to treat the risk of causing or contributing to gross human rights abuses as legal compliance issue wherever they operate. I think that is um, very clear. In other words, they are um, is sort of a long arm jurisdiction um, in terms of the compliance and observance of the rights between businesses um, and human rights, ensuring that business observe human rights protections. And the also some of there's some key questions set out just to leave you with and what a business should ask themselves. Um, One is that is there a need to sequence responses to any adverse human rights impacts that the business have identified, or are they such that they can address them in parallel? I mean, that's self evident. And the other thing is if there is a need to prioritize in order to sequence our responses, is there a mean of assessing the severity of the impact? The other question is, are there systems or that exist to assess severely the impacts, to take into account scope, scale, and the possibility of remedial action? And do they reflect any potential impact in terms of severity and how it should be a priority for action regardless of its possibility? Uh, is there particular attention paid to individuals belonging to vulnerable groups who may suffer the most severe human rights impact? Do they identify situations where there is a delay in responding to an actual impact, which may make it harder to remedy? And once the most severe human rights impacts have been assessed, are there systems that automatically move on to the next most severe impacts once those have been addressed? So that are some of the key points that the businesses should be asking themselves in terms of their human rights duties, especially in this day and age where the issues around environment, human rights protections, in terms of freedom of association, the slavery issues, the liberty and security of the person, um, the human treatment, uh, imprisonment for contractual obligations, the right to freedom of movement, the due process when facing, um, severe state expulsion, for example, expulsion, fair trial, free from retroactive criminal law. It's a very long list that is sort of is listed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, um, the and also some of the conventions related to um, the International Labour Organization or labor-related issues, such as the right of association and the right to organize, collective bargaining, forced labor conventions, the remuneration conventions, minimum age convention, uh, child labor, and so forth, and so forth. And so, I mean, there we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. I hope that just gives us an initial um, overview of the relationship between business and human rights and the responsibility of businesses and towards human rights protection in the context of work, um, value chain, access to services, the benefits thereof, and their impacts on um, the human rights. So that we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer, and we will speak again. Thank you.